I'm Joe Brooks, founder and director of Community Works Institute, and I want to introduce our host and also our awesome guest this afternoon. This is our CWI Spotlight Series, and Community Works Institute, very quickly, is an organization that's been around since 1995. We focus on professional development for educators and work with schools and teachers and occasionally and often students, focused around connecting students and learning in the classroom to the local community, and in many, many different ways. Ethnography is a very big piece of that for us, service learning, sustainability, and place-based education. So I don't want to use up a lot of our valuable time. We're on from 1 to 2 Pacific time this afternoon, and it's also, if you have any trouble with the connection, it's streaming on Community Works Institute's Facebook page as well. So without further ado, I'll introduce my esteemed colleague, Zach Ritter. Zach and I have been doing some great work the past couple of years together, and Zach's been doing great work for many years. I'll throw out a few things and you can more properly introduce yourself, but we've worked together during a number of institutes. He's very focused on social justice and is our lead associate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Zach has consulted with schools and educators from all over the country, literally. And he's here with us today to host a discussion with William Dahlin, our guest, Zach's guest, around using public policy to build social justice. And Zach is also, I should say, the Assistant Dean of Student Affairs at the University of Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, here in the Los Angeles area, and is, has a large weight he's carrying, he and his colleagues down there in these COVID times, trying to keep these students fed and watered and somehow mentally healthy. It's tough times for students. Am I right, Zach?
It's true. It is all true.
K to 16. So why don't you take over and I'll back out.
Awesome. No,
thank you. And thank you, William.
Yeah, and we have some guests too. See, we have some folks, and Danielle is here. This is very exciting. Sunday afternoon in pandemic land. I'm Zach Ritter. I am a diversity consultant, associate dean of students at Dominguez Hills. I've worked in other institutions like University of Redlands, where our paths crossed. And yeah, I don't want to. I want you to introduce yourself, but I know William as one of the funniest guys I've ever met. Also, we just had amazing conversations at University of Redlands, so much so that I asked you to be my TA for a class, and then I ended up getting another job at another institution, and you, as an undergrad, you basically just taught this whole class on your own, which is amazing. I was really just helping you with grad school, and then you made someone cry in the class, which is also interesting. But with poignant in your poetry and your prose, you have gone on to do Coro, which you're shaking your head, which I'm interested for you to talk about, the Coro internship. And then you are now at UCLA in the public policy master's. So I don't know, who is William Dahlin, and what is William Dahlin passionate about?
Okay, well, I just want to clear the air on the crying part. The student in the class is a friend of mine. Like we became friends in the class. She lived in the same dorm as I did, and she cried because I was talking about the effects of Chernobyl. It was not, she was very upset about the content, and just wanted to clear the air on that.
Chernobyl it's not a happy matter.
Not a happy matter at all. And there was a lot of reindeer that were killed in across Scandinavia, and that factoid on how they hired a bunch of hunters to go around hunt these reindeer because they were radioactive, and then they had to bury them.
You told me they had to spray paint, they did like cement
Yeah.
them underground and
Yeah,
then
they
spray
print
paint green, something.
green or yellow or something like that, because they were like, we're trying to notify people who might ever dig this up trying to look for something, don't look here.
And don't eat these reindeer, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was quite upsetting to people in the class. Just wanted to put that out there. I have quite a. Do you want me to talk about my history, my path? What do you want me to go on?
Well, let's start with this. You know, a lot of K through 16 educators are on this call or will listen to it later. In your journey, was there a teacher or teachers that inspired you to think in creative ways, to look at social justice issues, to look at race, class, gender issues? Because when I met you, you know, immediately you seemed more older than you were, and you seemed much more mature for your age, and you were interested in how society works, how it functions, what are the downfalls of it, and how we can change it. Is there someone in your K through, well, let's start K through 12 experience and then maybe college experience that got you interested in these things?
Yeah, I've had such a kind of wild set of educate like K through 12 was quite a complex situation for me. I like did normal school through elementary, and Miss Steinberg, my third and fourth grade teacher, I remember like she had such a big impact on me because when I found out she was going to be my fourth grade teacher, I just remember being so elated. And I mean, I had a very tumultuous childhood,
Mhm.
and she was just somebody who was very structured and also would just try to make things very fun.
Mhm.
And I think she was just the best, like in that way. And just like, I don't know, like she made like class cleanup fun. Like she'd play the peanut butter jelly song, and you'd have to clean up the classroom. And like it just random little things like that. I mean, it's social engineering kind of because you're trying to handle a bunch of 8-year-olds who are running around and knock into you, and like people like knocked her over and stuff. Like being an elementary school teacher is incredibly difficult. Like I can't even imagine how she did it. But I very much was like a problem kid, and I didn't feel that from her. Like
Mm.
I think probably like I was a little bit more behaved with her, but she was just very supportive in that way. You know, that was a big deal. And then I traveled a lot, so I did school online through middle school and high school for the most part.
Because you were in different countries, right?
Yeah, my family when I was 12 started traveling for international films, and so in middle school I wasn't involved on set, but when I was in high school I was. And so I kind of like was around a bunch of like cameramen and, you know, lighting guys and stuff, and conversations in like production office and stuff. Like I kind of had work experience in high school, and that was a big part of my education. But I also will shout out Mr. Hayes in 7th grade. My uncle, when we got back from the first movie, yeah, when I was 13, I went to 7th grade, and probably the most like vocal social justice kind of advocate I ever had was a theater teacher.
Mm.
I just remember he would, you know, it was theater, but he would just kind of like educate us about the world at large.
Mm.
And it was very, very common for it was 2007, 2008. And so it was very common for kids to just call everything gay.
Mm.
Like people would just be like, "Oh, that's gay," you know, like they would just say it, you know, everyone kind of said it.
Mm.
And I just remember like he like recoiled, and he was just like, do any of you know about the AIDS crisis?"
Mm.
And it was just like he just like went on like a 20-minute like he was like Shakespearean trained actor, and
Wow.
just like him like talking about all of these things. He's like, "This is what gay people have gone through." And I just like remember this kid, he was just like, "I don't have a problem with gay people. I just use the word, I apologize." But he was just so prophetic and just telling us about the world. That was a really big deal. And then being on film sets and talking about the news was also a very big educational experience.
Well, so tell us about the countries you were in, because I remember you were talking about China and you mentioned some other ones, but you also mentioned being a troubled youth. Tell us about that.
I had a very tumultuous upbringing. My mom lost her battle with cancer when I was growing up, and like something that was actually I was adopted by my uncle. My uncle was going through my report cards, and he was just like, "Wow, that is surprising." Like he was just like the stuff that they would write. It's just like cries in the corner, and stuff like that. It's just like is very troubled in a wide variety of ways, because of what I like would go home and my mom was barely able to like really compose herself, and so like that has an impact. And once I like got adopted by my uncle, things just kind of he's like a German accountant. He's very into order, and I that's something I needed because I just was living in a very wild kind of environment. And so yeah, just like kind of the opposite, just pure order. And yeah, and then the countries, he came to the US he became a US citizen, but he traveled back and forth between here and Germany for decades. But he like travels for film, and he lived in Jamaica and India and all these places.
Wow.
But he became a specialist in China for the most part. So I spent in total about 3 years in China. And those were probably the most impactful. I spent some time in Germany, spent some time in Indonesia and Hong Kong, visited a bunch of places. But China was kind of the big experience, the big, like a lot of life-changing moments there.
So being outside of America and being in China, what did that make you? I mean, we've had conversations where you were analyzing Chinese society and some of the issues there, but how did it give you a different type of lens to view the US?
I mean, something that is just really fascinating is, just differences between people. In China, there's like a very complex history with European society, colonialism, etc. But in China, like people would see me and just kind of go, "Whoa!" Like it was a very much a thing where people were just like, I remember like I was 12 and it was a mortifying experience, but someone just being like coming like right up to my face and they're like, "Whoa, that's what you look like up close." Because like they like if you turn on, I remember like one of the first things I did when I got to China, there was like a TV. It was like a prefabbed like house. I turned on the TV and it was Sky High, like the Michael Angarano film. Like it was like a huge thing growing up for me, but it was like dubbed in Chinese. And so like a big thing for them is American movies dubbed in, British movies, whatever. Like they're just dubbed in Chinese. And so like they know what, like they're interconnected. They have supermarkets. Like it's very modern for the most part. But you also see the parts that are not modern. So there are people who are getting water from wells, and there are people who are living in kind of shanties in a lot of places as well. But just a big thing for me was like the difference where people would be like, "That's crazy," but it wasn't in any way like hurtful. Where in the United States, I have friends who are like, "Oh yeah, if I go to the Midwest, if you're Latino or something, it's." It can be like a tense type of difference where there it's just pure novelty, I'd say. And
so
that is funny.
You didn't feel like it was like a microaggression or that they were exoticizing you?
I mean, exoticized, I'm not sure, but all I know, it wasn't like hostile.
Sure.
And so it was, just experiencing difference in that way. And then the politics, whole other thing. Whole other thing. But just in terms of like interacting with people in society, it's humbling to not be able to speak with anybody, and kind of like work with translators. Anytime like people apologize to me here for not speaking very good English. They speak Russian or Spanish or Korean or something. I'm like, do not apologize. Like I've been in the same situation. Like I'm not gonna criticize you.
Hmm. Do you mentioned once that one of your caretakers, there was some issues with substance abuse. Do you feel like you gravitated towards public policy, education, curiosity, because I guess maybe for some time it wasn't as safe as it should have been at home?
Yeah, the part of the tumultuous childhood, and I think in retrospect, like the trials and tribulations of my mom was being with my father, who I haven't spoken to directly in I think 7 years, and I've only met him like a dozen times, I'd say, and the like substance abuse and the way that affected them, I kind of just know that, and like my family, like reflecting like the information of what was going on in the relationship permeated everyone, and just kind of seeing on a familial level how they're like, oh yeah, this one incident, this happened and that was outrageous, is very informative when you're like I was in a public policy class my sophomore year of college, and now I'm getting my master's in it. And anytime people talk about something very abstract, I kind of go to those memories where they're like, oh, this happened. And my family were like displaced after World War II, and during World War II as well. And it's just like anytime people talk about like displaced people, it's just like it's not only like reading firsthand accounts, it's just like, oh, these are the stories I was told. Having that personal connection, I think can also improve your thinking about these issues as well. Like having firsthand, like somebody telling you something is more impactful than reading it. It just is.
Well, then we kind of connected on that issue, because you were saying that you're very interested in Jewish stuff, and I took you to Shabbat sometimes, and you would teach me stuff about Jewish stuff that I didn't even know about, and you made a joke that I think is pretty poignant, where you were like, so like half my family were complicit in like killing Jewish people and Romani and other people, but the other like half tried to save and help people. What Tell me a little bit about that, like just knowing that family history, how it made you, I don't know, curious and interested about history.
I mean, that's the thing is Germans in general, like it's just not a pretty history. I mean, no group of people, people who are like, oh, my family are frontiers, and it's like we're frontiermen. It's just like, well, that entailed a lot. Southerners have a similar thing. I mean, all groups of people have some type. It's just the most famous archetypal evil type is German. And like family stories were basically just history lessons on World War II. And the firsthand experience of stuff that was going on is still like, I still learn sometimes new things. It's just like, oh yeah, like the streets were being strafed, and you could see like the pilots looking down and like pointing at you. Like it's just like stuff like that. Like when they're flying your adrenaline's so high that you can see all that happening. Like those people who are not interested in their families' like stories and like how it connects to the broader fabric of history, I think is boring. I think a lot of times people might segment it. They're like, oh, grandma went through this crazy stuff. And it's just like, that's a really interesting story. I love hearing older people quite often, just like the quiet grandpa in the corner has a crazy story. And you're like, oh, he's kind of got the 1,000-yard stare. Oh, he has the 1,000-yard stare because he's still dealing with a lot, that stories.
Right. No, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, we nerd out about history and stories because I grew up with that. You know, grandma was in Auschwitz and my dad was in a refugee camp, and so I think we bonded over those issues. And I think you and I would get frustrated at other um, whatever, just white folks that didn't interrogate their own family history, because I think sometimes they're like, oh, I'm white, I don't have a culture, I don't have history. It's like, have you studied the last 2,000 years of what's been going on in the world? Like, there is definitely a history. It's just like you're divorced from it, or your parents don't know it, or maybe your grandparents are not around anymore. But you know, what do we used to talk about James Baldwin a lot with, until white folks understand this history, they can't be set free from it. And in a way, they're imprisoning Black and brown folks and everybody else and other white folks, because we're not dealing with this ugly history that has happened both in America and abroad. And I think we would talk about Germany and how Germany has really confronted its past, but its neighbors, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Poland, have not, and America has not. And so I think something that we did in our class, which was called The Revolution Might Be Televised, Social Justice History Through Music and Movies, we picked out 7 different social movements, and we really tried to get folks to think critically about, Black civil rights from a different historical lens than just the stuff that was taught in K through 12. Tell us a little bit about your experience being basically a TA at a young age, and like, how did being a mentor and a teacher for you as an undergrad? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, definitely with incredible amount of support from you and from Dalen Montgomery was. Yeah, I learned a lot, as well as have learned a fair amount about different social movements, and have been able to like talk with people in that class. That it was really rewarding. Something also, just to touch on that point that you made about whiteness. I mean, in any culture, there is going to be kind of like a prominent group, and the thing that is very unique about the United States is, like I have learned this from a lot of people in the last few years. Like, their grandparents usually spoke something else. So like, it's just like, oh yeah, like I'm white, and it's just like, oh, yeah, but grandpa spoke Swedish, or grandpa spoke, Danish, Russian, Dutch, what have you, Gaelic. And the United States is pretty much an all-encompassing force that kind of just homogenizes people in a lot of ways. And I think in that class, we actually were very lucky to have people from different places in the US like talk about, people whose family were Chicano, and like can trace back to like when the Spanish were in California.
Wow.
And like, that is a very interesting, unique perspective that is so complicated. And then someone from the South as well, like, very interesting conversations got to be had. I think connecting your your history and your place in the moment is very important. And just being open to, I mean, people always say these kind of platitudes, be open to other perspectives, but a lot of times people, I think, govern what other people think about their identity and stuff. And quite often, I think it's just defensiveness. Like, people don't want to hear what other people have to say. Just,
And yeah, I mean, I think even in this era of kind of renewed national awareness of white racism, which a lot of Black and brown folks have known since day one. It's interesting that on the census, they have gone back to Irish American. Like, is your family like, French American or whatever like that? Even getting white folks to interrogate their own usually unexamined history, like you're saying, grandpa spoke Yiddish or Gaelic or whatever it was. Do you feel like being at University of Redlands, we had our own set of systemic racism, systemic classism, and sexism, and there were some protests when we were there, and rightfully so, right? I mean, there was a lot of issues at the school, and actually now the president is stepping down, which is interesting. But navigating that delicate campus climate, being a white guy or even a German American guy, did you feel that was difficult as a teacher and a TA? Did you have to do some either code switching or was it difficult as a teacher to navigate that?
I mean, I have kind of come around to this conclusion more recently, but leading with some awkwardness, I think, is important.
Interesting.
Because I think if you're going to try to be too stoic about this stuff, it's just like racism has been very uncomfortable for everyone involved. Incredibly damaging to African Americans. Native Americans have had an insane history, not only in this country, in Canada and Mexico, throughout Latin America, the Caribbean. All people have very interesting stories to say, and in the United States, there's so many different histories that are not pretty, and that is not those are not historical events that people got to just talk about, and that is so much of what we're doing now, is just talking about facts and kind of weighing importance of different pieces of information. So something that is very big is kind of the conversation between race and class in this country. And I think we're starting to have a very intense conversation about race, but we're also having a growing conversation about class. And we're also seeing the Republicans starting to talk about that a lot more. And that is just something that is so fascinating, because they're claiming they're the party of the working class because they won the poorest districts and the Democrats won the richest. So that is a conversation that there are so many conversations that are growing as well. I think with all of that going on, you have to have some acknowledgement of awkwardness. I'd go to African American Union at one point at Redlands. It was called Black Brilliant Leaders Advocating Color Consciousness, I believe.
Yep.
And I remember I was there once, and this guy Jordan was very cutting. He was just so deadpan, and I got along with him, but I just remember I was one of maybe two non-Black people in the meeting, and he just turned to me. He's like, "Why are you here?" And I could tell he was just like, "Do not come here to feel better or anything." And I was just like, "No, I'm here because I'm friends with those two people in the corner." And I was just just supporting him, just this is super I can't relate to anything you're saying, and I'm just taking it in. And I'm not going to tell you how to think about any of these things. If you want my perspective, I can tell it to you. But I was just yeah, it's awkward. That's fine. And he was just kind of
because he was probably testing you a little bit to because I would imagine if you've been burned by white people that here's a white person in a Black space, and then it's what are you doing here? Did that relationships change over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think people in various ways can tell your intentions by your actions. I mean, I think your intended actions can have different impacts, but I think quite often people can sense being genuine or kind of I don't know. I think if you're coming off as trying to say, look at how not bad I am,
right.
regardless of what the issue is, that's gonna ring kind of weird. But if you're just kind of like, I'm awkward, I kind of say some things that, like, I'm speaking from ignorance, and you just kind of shrug. You're just like, this is what I know.
Mm.
Just like,
Right.
people will absolutely get on your back,
Right.
but I think it's always good just to be humble and just be like, I think this, but I could be totally wrong.
Right. And I think there's something really, you do something really well, which I think is you understand when spaces aren't for you. And you're just like, hey, am I allowed to be here? Is this okay? And if I'm here, like, I'm gonna kind of sit in the back and just like, if I'm called on, I'll speak, but I know this space is not for me. And something you did, I think, really well at Redlands was navigating different spaces in a really delicate and respectful manner. Right, not only in Black, but also I think, you were were you the president of Lust? How did, tell me about that experience.
I was president of Listening, Understanding Sexuality Together as well. I mean, I'll also just be open. It's like I put my foot in my mouth plenty times as well, and it's just like, yeah, it's just like I think it's worse if you double down and you're like, I didn't mean to. If you're too defensive,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's good, and people navigated this in classrooms and other things. Like, I said things and people were like, that's untrue, I don't agree, and I'm just like, all right.
Hmm.
Like, I think that's also important to do. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways that people live, and there's, like, thinking about diversity, we think about it in kind of major categories that are all social constructs.
Hmm.
Yeah, just, I don't know, probably one of the biggest divisions in Redlands was people from the Northwest and people who are not. Like, people whose main interest was outdoor activities were a distinct group of people, separate from everyone else. And I don't think it fits. I think there's a strong correlation with being white, middle class, what have you. But I think categories are quite often prescriptive instead of descriptive, and I think it's good to kind of be like, how would you group people together? Yeah, like, just seeing the actual diversity, just like how much complexity there is, you can see patterns. I'm also speaking very abstractly, and that's how I think.
No, and then let's get into that, because I think that's one of the reasons I was attracted to our friendship, is the way your brain works is really unique and complex. And I think something that's interesting about you is that you were very open about issues of class, very open about issues of race, and when you're wrong and you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'm wrong, let's talk about it. And also issues of sexuality. And I think you and a lot of students at Redlands kind of, well, taught me a lot of stuff about like being more open about sexuality. And also, so Lust, you guys would, let's understand sexuality together. Y'all would meet in a space and talk about awkward moments on dates, or amazing moments on dates, or like in long-term relationships when the love is going really well or when the love isn't. And you would talk a lot about consent. And that was the first place. And I maybe was more traditional and like got a little bit maybe intimidated, because like, whoa, we didn't do this and talk about this in college. But people would talk about like BDSM. About,
Okay, yeah.
Like a lot of open sexual stuff. And I was just like, whoa, like part of me was like, oh my God, this is the future. Like the kids are all right. What was that an interesting, like, liberatory experience for you?
I think it was really fascinating because people were not all on board with, talking about their relationships. And yeah, I mean, there was like a lot, there were many more opinions on that, and similar clubs. There was Pride and some other organizations that were doing really, really amazing stuff, and like making a space. I mean, a lot of that stuff is just making space for people to come together. So something I heard recently was your 20s is a bunch of excuses to hang out with people. Like making events is a bunch of excuses, like let's cook, and then you end up, it's primarily just a social function. College is quite often the same thing. You know,
Which, by the way,
yeah,
by the way, should be through your 30s, 40s, and 50s. And we're in this
course.
pandemic, people are hungry for that, right? And that's really what humans want, just to connect. But okay, sorry, go ahead. You were talking about fraternity.
No, I totally get you. The thing is a lot of people were like, why would I talk about like dates I go on and stuff? And I was very much just someone who listened. Like I like would just kind of like hear lots of stories. Like something that is so interesting is people in my generation, it's incredibly common for people to be in long distance relationships. And there was one moment when I was in college that I was like, that is something that needs to be studied. And the probably are people who are doing it, but it is something that is just so fascinating that people, like I knew someone in high school who I went up to her and I was like, what are you doing for spring break? She's like, I'm going to Scotland. And I was like, what? She's like, oh, I'm visiting my girlfriend. And I was like, oh, that's right. You're dating someone who you met online, and she like traveled in high school across the globe. You know, like that is something that does not have a total analogous function. You know, there were, you know, Benjamin Franklin being prophetic and writing to people in France and stuff. There was that, but it's not like he came home every day and spoke to his, you know, significant other. And yeah, sometimes I do treat social situations too much like a research paper where I'm just like collecting information because I think it's interesting. But I think yeah, like relationships are something that through technology and through various changes in society are going through such tremendous changes, and it's interesting to see. That the way that people are living, but I think it's also interesting to also be from these conversations make decisions on if we're like, oh, this is something that's going on, it's bad.
Right.
Because quite often you can kind of just justify it and be like, this is the modern world.
Right.
I think it's good to do both.
You said something interesting, well, now about how your brain works in collecting this information. And also you were talking about, I mean, we should get into what we're here to talk about, is public policy.
Yeah.
So you were saying that we as a country are now just collecting stories and collecting facts. And maybe, you know, we should say, we often talk about two Americas, right? The kind of white America and then Black and brown America. And so I would say white America is maybe coming around to like, oh my God, there's like a problem here. And let's collect stories and let's like do kind of like diversity the 90s way, which is like, hey, let's do like, let's print out the pamphlets and have like the Rainbow Coalition on paper, but maybe not in reality. And I think after George Floyd, like some of these companies are like, oh, if we don't do it, we're going to be out of business. So maybe we should try to promote and get the board of trustees and the president to be more diverse, and maybe not just diverse, but actually more justice focused. And where are we putting our money and all these types of things. Thinking about public policy and some of the stuff you're learning at UCLA now, let's tackle a couple issues, right? So first, let's talk about reparations. So 2008, the US government apologized officially for slavery. I think it was mostly for slavery in terms of the like African transatlantic slave trade. But I don't know if I don't think it was about Native American slavery, which also took place. And it didn't really apologize for the lynchings of not only Black people, but also in the Southwest, which we don't talk about a lot, where it's like 871 recorded lynchings of Mexican people in the Southwest.
Yeah, the largest lynching in history was Chinese people in Los Angeles, the largest that we know of. But there's, yeah, no, continue, sorry.
No, yeah, that was like in the 1871 with like the kind of the birth of modern LA, right? Which ironically, those Chinese folks were killed in a place called like N-word Alley, right? It's like,
Yeah, well, now it's Union Station, which is even more poetic and disturbing, that people who helped build the railroad system killed it. Now, like the centerfold for Los Angeles's rail.
well, and Union Station was built and it wiped out Chinatown, right? Because they wanted to get rid of these slums where these Chinese, people were living, and then they made Chinatown later on down the way. And that's the story of LA, basically. We don't want these people here. Either we're going to demolish it or earthquake is going to, and then we're going to get rid of these folks. Chavez Ravine, so on and so forth. So we're talking about reparations. What would public policy look like in terms of reparations if we did it on a local or a national level? Because that city in North Carolina, right, Ashland,
Yeah.
They voted to do reparations. So what are some of the proposals?
Yeah, I'm not 100% familiar with the various, like how you roll it out. I just know that, like anything else in American public policy, it turns into a partisan debate, primarily focused at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is we're in a moment very much right now where we are having like these conversations about big ideas. Let's do things that are different, but the conversation is going nowhere fast.
Yeah.
And if I mean, throwing it back to you, do you want to talk about political feasibility, or do you want to talk about how you actually would, in theory, get something done? Because both, there's so many different dimensions to it.
Well, I want you to talk about a public policy issue that you're passionate about, that you think can come to fruition, but to bookend it with reparations. I think it's interesting that the government in so many ways will say, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but not that much. Like there's limits to that mattering. And I think some of the proposals that could happen is like baby bonds for college for Black kids. I think there's such a lack of imagination in the, like, I don't know, from like certain white voters, where it's like, we can't just like cut checks for people. It was like we did in 1987 for Japanese folks who were interned in the camps, right? They got $20,000, which doesn't erase the trauma or the pain, but it's something. And even my grandmother got reparations, $300 a month from the German government. But I don't think a lot of people even know those little examples of reparations, so people don't think it's possible, or I should say certain white folks. But there's other voices saying it shouldn't just be a check. It should be certain Black folks don't have to pay taxes, or certain Black folks get admission to college. But even in progressive California, we just voted down affirmative action again. So I don't know, what is the issue that is you're wrapping your brain around that you think we can do some real action on, but the public just is not understanding it yet?
So just to do a first point, I'd question the premise of California being progressive, because I'd say that for the most part, people don't think in terms of left versus right. And where left versus right comes from: the two sides of the French Revolution, the halls where they'd meet to discuss. The people on the right side were the people who were like, the monarchy was bad, but we'll just kind of be like England. And then the people on the left were the Jacobins. And then there's also people in the middle, and a lot of them actually got along with Napoleon. So people in the middle actually ended up some of the best off people. But the thing about California that is just endlessly fascinating is we are, just kind of the stereotypical like high tax, ultra liberal, like et cetera, et cetera. And I dare anyone to go outside an hour outside of Los Angeles and to continue thinking in that kind of very narrow way. It's fun meeting people for an hour in any direction from Los Angeles because they're very similar communities. There are so many different nuances to California. Like we are the home of Reagan and Nixon. We are the home of Kevin McCarthy, I think, who's the minority leader. Like we are. Huh?
Daryl Issa.
Daryl Issa, yeah, he just got re-elected in a different district.
Yeah.
I think there's so many different nuances that kind of thinking in terms of conservative versus progressive kind of erases. And the affirmative action thing is such a complex thing and has so many different meanings to different people. Something that I will I'll emphasize is there is a difference between kind of objective reality, where we're talking about like numbers and figures, numbers of deaths, numbers of births, like these kind of more concrete things, and meaning, because you can have meaning that is real. Like Bertrand Russell talks about, like in The Problem of Philosophy, he's talking about writing. Like it's a thing where all of a sudden in the book he kind of breaks and talks about himself, and he's just like talking about all these different philosophers, and he's just like, right now I'm writing on a table and my arm is on the table and I don't know if my memories are real, because my memories could be fabricated, because people make up stuff all the time, and this entire thing could be a dream, but the feeling of my arm on the table is real. Like in this moment, it is real. And just like that, people's perceptions matter to them, and they are real, regardless of if they're correct or not. People kind of will just throw around stuff. I see signs in my neighborhood where people are like, science is real. And it's just like, yeah, like you saying that is real to you. People aren't necessarily, like, people aren't thinking in these categories. They think about in terms of meaning to them. And so something that just in general is very difficult is people try moving these meanings and having other people accept them. And that's not how people work. People have their own systems of thinking that are not related. And I think focusing on how people can agree about certain objective things is going to be better. So I think you could, cut you can cut 5% of the US budget and dedicate it exclusively to congressional districts with more than 50% of African Americans. You could do something like that in theory. But what is the main issue is in the United States, race and class are incredibly correlated. There are probably more white people who are near the poverty line than there are Black people, because it's 65-70% of the US. We forget Appalachia exists. But if you live in a city, the urban core is, for the last since the Great Migration after World War I, have been heavily African American and neglected. And yeah, I think unfortunately, even though it's not as satisfying to be like, this is a historic issue that needs to be like, you need to recognize that African Americans went through these atrocities, that you should just, for that reason alone, cut checks or something. I think that deals with meaning that is very divisive, as frustrating as that is, because I recognize it's like, objectively, that is the things that people went through are disgusting. I think anti-poverty programs, people kind of feel slighted because they're like, it's something that affects a huge amount of African Americans and other people, but it's still kind of slighting the history that people are like, it is important to people.
So let's go with the anti-poverty stuff, right? You said something earlier about Republicans branding themselves as the party of the poor. And even Donald Trump was like, I love uneducated people, or undereducated, whatever he said.
Mhm.
I love the poorly educated is what he said.
Yes.
And you're also talking about reality being altered, because Donald Trump has made it so easy to be like, we are the good guys, those people are the devils. Do you really do you love crime? Do you love open borders and crime? And do you love MS-13? And, do you love all these terrible things? And so it's really kind of a gladiatorial sports thing where we're the good guys, they're bad. And I was watching his speech yesterday in Georgia, and he was saying, we must have won because the Democrats hate oil, guns, and God. And I think that encapsulates a lot of really interesting, like oil, guns, and God. Okay. And he also plays into this notion of like, we have folks of color and in high positions. So we can't be racist. I'm the least racist person in the room. So I don't know, how have the Republicans done an effective job, I don't want to call it a good job, but an effective job of painting themselves as the poor people's party, even if they're just very corporate and don't have poor people's public policy interests in mind?
Well, I think if you kind of just get into that whole discussion, then you get into the disagreements about meaning, because from my understanding of a lot of conservatives, they're like, they are pro-American, and American is inherently kind of colorblind. And so they're like, yeah, I'm for everybody who is pro-American. And a lot of that is like perception of, like admitting America did bad things is anti-American. And that is a perspective that people have. And it's also something that people have around the world. Like there are so many different conversations about like a nation's like ethos. I think that can get very complicated. Objective. I mean, right now, political gravity is being defied by poor people in various places supporting policies that are maybe
It's their own interest.
Right, but at the same time, like people are not rational, they're rationalizing. People are not like purely thinking in terms of this amount. I was reading this paper, and it's just like people, regardless of class, support migration if the people are highly educated.
Right.
Across the board.
Right.
It's not like people are like, oh, my job's going to be taken. Like people are like, oh no, but rich people coming in, it is different than a poor immigrant. Like that is the thinking consistently.
Right.
People, I don't know, like
with taxes, right? Trump. So you had two populist movements going at the same time, one Bernie Sanders and one Trump. And then obviously we know which one won out. But Trump or whoever on the conservative side can say they are going to raise your taxes. But the other part of that sentence could be, if we just took a little bit off the top from billionaires, you, poor person, could live better, right? Which is kind of what Bernie was saying. And so I think a lot of folks gravitated towards Bernie, but it's easy for Trump, and I guess Trump's people really studied like Hitlerian stuff, right? Because the Lügenpresse becomes the lying press or the fake media. And if you tell a lie enough, it becomes the truth. And so what do we do in a new social media environment where it's really easy to spread disinformation, and good public policy doesn't really matter anymore, right? Because it's not even, like take, for example, the Affordable Care Act. A lot of people got healthcare and it wasn't perfect and it needs to be improved. But I would, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but objectively, it was effective public policy. But if you twist it and get folks in different states to hate it, and racialize it, right? I'm not going to take that healthcare that's for Black and brown folks. I'm a Appalachian white. They won't. Perception trumps public policy.
Perception is always trumped public policy. I mean, that's the thing. Is this is what I'm studying in theory is the like technical boring stuff. The reason it's really interesting is that you are trying to match the objective reality, like as objective as you can get, like as much as you can objectively say there's money in a bank, gold in Fort Knox.
Right.
You're balancing that with people's perceptions, and that's where the complexity exists, because people said, get your hands off of my keep your government hands from my social security.
Right.
And you can kind of just point to that person and be like, you're stupid, you don't understand this government program.
Right.
You can also say, talk to that person, they understand perfectly well, I paid into social security, I'm getting the money back. So like I think there's two sides of the perception and the reality. I don't know, the perception has always trumped numbers.
No,
like,
I agree, and
that is completely the case. And also people, and because of that, you have to understand that people think in terms of stories. They do not think in terms of, like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. What they were doing is they were kind of telling part of a story. They were primarily talking about a policy that people were very much on board with. Since the Occupy movement in the early 2010s, I think there's been like an activated like criticism of neoliberalism, Obama, like Clinton style, like moderate politics. But that is a system because Democrats have, won national elections, but they've had to do it in the wake of Republicans since the 1970s changing and having a huge impact. And a lot of it is because of really good storytelling. Like regardless of how infuriating he might be, Trump is able to grab the news media, and people will run it constantly. And now he's starting to become more boring because he's not necessarily going to have as much relevance. But you need to keep in mind storytelling. And as infuriating as it might be, like conversations about welfare and stuff quite often come down to what does it look like? And kind of just saying, here's a policy proposal is not enough. You have to wrap it in a story regardless of what you want.
So okay, Jonathan Metzl wrote that book, Dying of Whiteness, right? And he's saying that there's a lot of folks that are voting against their own interests and are literally dying of whiteness, that they're clinging to their identity as a white person, and I'm losing my quote unquote country because all these fill in the blanks scary group are taking over, and LGBT folks got the right to marriage and DACA folks got the right to DACA. What have I gotten recently? And I'm not going to take this healthcare, and literally I'm going to die because I read that healthcare as Black and brown healthcare from Obamacare. What do we, if it's all about storytelling, why aren't there more storytellers who are saying, you want better housing? You want better healthcare? You want better education? I can give it to you. I mean, why don't we have someone on the other side or whatever being like, I alone can give you all these things. We're just going to take a little bit from the rich cats, and we're going to take a little bit from the military, and we're going to give it to you because you're the taxpayer. Why haven't we seen those folks since, I don't know, like Huey Long, or since those other radical populist movements?
Oh, well, Huey Long is really fascinating character because I think he's a very good person to speak to. He talked about things in terms of the buffet table, and that, like, when was the last time a Democrat, thought in that way? Their main group of people is college educated people, and so college educated people who are very optic conscious and don't want things that are offensive. I mean, I think for the most part, people's kind of disgust with Trump across the board was his dialogue. When you can kind of point to there being quite a lot of consistency to American policy across the board,
Yeah.
like between Clinton and Trump, things have not changed that much. There's primarily consistency in terms of foreign policy, domestic policy. Those are the two kinds of policies. Right? But there's, like Huey Long spoke to a bunch of Cajun farmers and said, "Oh, all of these," because a lot of people who were actually in New Orleans were Republican, and he was a Democrat. And the Democrats in the South were primarily bourbon Democrats. They were pro-business.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was kind of just saying to all these like Cajuns who had lost a lot during the 1927 Mississippi floods that destroyed a bunch of levee systems, just gave out and destroyed a lot of people's farmlands. And horrifyingly enough, the living conditions for African Americans in a lot of those places became so bad that that's one of the pushes that caused, you see a spike in people moving to places like Chicago right before the Great Depression, because their housing got wiped out, and then they tried putting them in concentration camps, basically. Yeah, like people called them like displaced person camps, but they like have armed guards and stuff, and people were like, enough is enough.
This is for Black people in the South?
Yeah, 1920s, and like 1927, there was a bunch of floods, and I think a few hundred people died. But for the most part, it was like slow-moving floods that you could kind of like. There's a song, "Levees Before the Levee Breaks." It's like a Led Zeppelin song, but it's also like an old blues song. It's about the levees being destroyed because of flooding, and as a result, there was huge migration because living conditions became worse. And that also affected, that led to populism and Huey Long. And because of him, I mean, if you've been to Baton Rouge, he made the tallest state capitol in the country to this day. He made it because he waited for, I want to say it was like Tennessee or another state was making its state capitol, and he waited with an architect until they were completed, and he was like, okay, make it a few stories taller. And I read an author, he was a Hungarian guy in the 1940s. He called Huey Long a fascist because he was just like, Huey Long used the rhetoric of Hitler, but for the left. And so he's just like somebody who's, and the thing also about Huey Long is he was not particularly anti-Black. Like he was kind of like, if you vote for me, like the few people who could vote, like there was a few areas where like they African Americans had some political power. He was just like, okay, if you vote for me, it's fine. Relative to other politicians at the time.
Right.
But at the same time, All the King's Men was kind of inspired by him, and people were like, that's how you would get a fascist in the United States. So so populism scares people in the establishment because you're taking decision making from people who are rational and giving it to the masses. But quite often populists are just the same group, but just using the groundswell support. I think it is always important to keep in mind people like Huey Long. I know you just mentioned that a little bit, but yeah, he's probably one of the most interesting figures, the kingfish that nobody talks about today.
So who killed him?
I know he was assassinated, and something that people kind of are very conspiratorial about is he was going to challenge FDR for the presidency, I think in 1936, because he was just like, FDR is like a centrist. Like he was like not enough. Just like H.P. Lovecraft was like FDR, H.P. Lovecraft is like famous for his like racism, but he was at the end, apparently he was very left wing, which is interesting.
He had a cat named N-word Man, right?
Yes, or at least there's a character in a.
I thought it was real cat. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But at the same time, like you remember that, but you don't remember the him saying FDR was too soft, right?
Right.
So, we and the reason for that is we in the United States, we think in terms of race, not class.
Right.
So
It's
that
both.
is the terrifyingly complex part of the American psyche.
Well, we got to wrap up soon, but let me ask you this.
Yeah.
The left is very corporate. The right is very corporate, but now has this weird, scary, like corporate populist, kind of like what Michelle Alexander talks about with the kind of and Isabel Wilkerson, the caste hierarchy that we have in this country, and that for some reason the rich whites team up with like poor whites and have this weird, strange bedfellow conglomeration. And in the end, rich people just get richer. Do you, from your work in Coro, I know we didn't get to talk about that, and I wanted to, from your work at Coro and now what you're seeing at UCLA public policy, do you think that America can get some type of movement that is more populist and less corporate? And what would that look like in the future? Because Trump, Trump is a coastal elite, and Trump is a wealthy person supposedly. So he's not really the messiah that I think the working class has been waiting for. So can America get past this, or do the kind of Teddy Roosevelt thing where they're union busting and more anti-corporate stuff? Will that happen in America?
I think back to, I was very fond of theory in undergrad, and I think it was Patricia Collins has an idea of the matrices of oppression. I remember that very well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the key kind of origins of the idea of like intersectionality is it's actually a lot more complex in theory.
Mm.
That we all have privilege and oppression of different sorts. And the thing is whoever is able to make various constituents kind of on the same team is going to be able to get their policies through. War and politics are very similar in the way that it's about people. It's about getting people on board. And if you don't think in terms of trying to grow your base, that you're going to lose. And so can there be a movement that, like a populist movement that's kind of all-encompassing? Probably the most famous thing about the left is that it's divided. It always has been, always will be.
Right.
Going back to the 1960s, a lot of like the new left came out of people saying we need to focus more on the LGBTQ community, and there's a bunch of people who are like Irish Catholic Union guys who are like, it's not my priority.
Right.
And as a result, I think it's kind of stuck. I don't see a grand figure coming together.
Mm.
What I do see is maybe, have you heard of the Great Divergence?
I heard of it.
Or the Great, not the Great Divergence. No, I think that might be what it's called. People like Marco Rubio are trying to, they are criticizing Biden from the left. Yeah, and so I just like politics is always changing. I think there is a chance that we could see something come out of left field, and people, one policy could, Bill Clinton cut a variety of welfare programs in the 1990s.
Uh-huh.
And that is something that was a goal of Ronald Reagan, but we don't consider Bill Clinton a right-wing president, right?
Huh.
Even though he successfully did something that Ronald Reagan tried to do, and the Democratic Senate did not allow him to do it.
And he shut down a lot of military bases in foreign countries.
Yes, and that was post Cold War. Like the 90s is. I think we're still trying to figure out what happened in the 90s. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're still kind of reaching out in the dark
Mhm.
from that period forward. I don't think we've moved on from the conversations that grew out of the 90s.
Right.
But I think it's more likely than that we will see surprise policies come out of something like a new group in the Republican Party. They seem to be a lot more adept at moving things around than the left. Because right now the conversation between the centrists and the progressives is kind of just leading to stalemate. And I think the Republicans are actually a lot more dynamic, a whole lot more dynamic.
Interesting. That's troubling. We got to wrap up, but where are you going to go with all this? Knowing all the things you know, what's the next step for William Dahlman?
My number is 818-427. No, hire me. No, I'm someone who's just constantly trying to learn more things, and it's kind of just knowledge for its own sake. I would like to apply it in different ways. Try to bring people together. I've worked with a number of Republicans and learned a lot from them, and people who are from every spectrum have interesting things to say, and I think just kind of like bringing people together, meeting people where they are, that's what I kind of hope to continue to do. And hopefully just learn more about my biggest interest is, I thought you were going to ask about globalization, but
I can go.
Globalization. Okay. Globalization is something that we thought about in the 90s as being the end of history, right? Francis Fukuyama, like history's done, like communism fell apart because of nationalism. And, that's the reason the Soviet Union fell apart. And the Polish and the Russians all wanted their own countries. And then capitalism kind of came out on top. And now we're all just going to be different versions of that. What actually has come out to be the case is a whole series of different competing ideas of what the future is going to be. And it seems like climate change is increasingly a roaring thing in everyone's ear.
Yep.
And people are kind of talking about, oh, well, veganism has become very popular. People have been very individualistic about how they're going to solve it, even though the Belt and Road Initiative is opening a new coal factory like every month.
What is
and a new coal plant is being opened across Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe.
Wow.
You changing your dietary preferences.
But I eat less meat, William.
Eating less meat is good. The human being should be doing that, but
also we need to close down these coal mines. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but that's the thing is coal exports from Australia have like remained steady, if not increased, to China. So I think climate change, the models are kind of evolving. I think it is absolutely a real thing, but people our perceptions of it are always kind of teetering a little bit, where we're like, that's unexpected. There's so much complexity around climate change and populism, the international system. We are not living in a world where everyone became a capitalist, like liberal society. We have nationalism coming up. We have left-wing movements coming up. I think there's such big conversations that are going on, when we need to be focusing a lot more on how it's affecting local areas. I think people read the Mueller report, and that's fantastic. You should read about, Japanese macroeconomics. You should read about Chinese influence in Africa and Latin America. I think you should focus on these big issues, but I think we need a lot more people focusing on city councils. And, the FBI arrested 2 people from the LA City Council this year.
Yeah.
And we somehow are talking about Trump every day.
Yeah.
And the pandemic, which is also very important to talk about. But we're not talking about city council every day.
Well,
I mean, that is the problem.
because cable news and the dying of local news networks
Yes.
has made us all polarized and focused more in DC, when it's like,
Yes.
also you need to think about Mr. Lung, and who was the other dude, who got arrested.
Yeah, Englander, and the gentleman from Boyle Heights. But I think the thing that we need to think about is, you can talk about the Green New Deal, you can talk about reparations being distributed in a national policy, but we need so much more conversation about local areas, and so much of it just comes down to zoning. It's just like, where are you actually going to put it? Like I learned a lot of Redlands. I think it was fantastic, but something I'm frustrated with is not learning about that more. Probably the biggest issue in public policy is land use, and people like that is something that will ruin, like, you'll ruin a dinner party if you come out strongly on one side.
My dad was a city planner, so zoning,
Yes.
you're talking about residential, industrial, or commercial, right? And getting those changed is very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, even within different categories, building housing is something that people are trying to do, and it just kind of turned into a war because of homelessness just increasing.
But how did they do it in Salt Lake City? Because how did they do that in Salt Lake City with they built a bunch of micro units for homeless folks?
I mean, I lived in Salt Lake in 2010 when I was working on, that was the first movie I worked on, and worked with Danny Boyle, amazing guy. Anywho, the problem of homelessness that we're experiencing now, I'm actually used to because of Utah. Because Utah has the Mormons have an incredible system of welfare and charity. Like, there's such a huge amount of output from there. And even go back to 2005, a lot of people who were displaced from we should call them refugees because their homes were destroyed and they had to run away. A lot of them went to Utah. More people than you would think. And like, it's primarily a white and Latino, some Native Americans there, but there aren't that many African Americans, but there was a large amount of African American homeless people. And so the thing is Salt Lake City was able to deal with it because there's a lot of land and it's cheap. In California, us solving the problem, everything costs so much. There's not like a one size fits all solution to this. And people are probably like angry. They're like, we should just solve homelessness. And it's just like, you need to change the laws on how big a unit can be, because do you know how much it costs to make a homeless, a unit for a homeless person? Over $500,000.
Oh, shoot.
Per unit. Do you know how much a parking spot costs in LA?
No.
Like $100,000.
Whew.
Yeah, like a one parking spot, because the land is so, people want to live here. People want to live here. And so even if you open a new piece of housing, someone in Iowa is kind of thinking about maybe coming to LA to pursue their dreams, or a company's thinking of moving from SF to LA. People in Texas, a lot of them, Texas can't compete with the educational output that California has. So the UC system overwhelms the amount of, there's so many people who want jobs who are qualified. There's so many people compared to Texas. There's no comparison. Like, the amount of students that the UC and CSU systems put out, it's just a workforce engine. And so the thing that inhibits people coming here is it costs a lot. So you need to build a lot of housing. You need better transportation. And those are issues that you solve on the local level. It doesn't matter. Your Green New Deal gets destroyed by people who are focused on keeping their neighborhoods a particular way. What we need to do is democratically figure out and a lot of it comes down to aesthetics. Like, people like their neighborhood to look a certain way, and people quite often understandably have concerns that that's racial. And I think there is absolutely racial components to that in some ways, but also people want to live in a nice looking place. If more people come in and everything's safe, that's fine, but you need to build trust.
Mhm.
And you need to, climate change could displace people, and we're going to need people moving into cities more.
Mhm.
Um, we're seeing like rural areas being ripped apart by young people just don't want to move there because there's no opportunities. We're going to need more housing, and we're going to need neighborhoods to change a little bit. But the way that we do that is local. So dealing with the global is, I think, solved at the local a lot more than we think.
So let's wrap on this question. For the folks that are listening, they're thinking maybe, well, I'm not an elected official. What can I do? I mean, I've gone to some of the city hall meetings, or I've gone to Black Lives Matter meetings, or I go to this organization that I'm passionate about. But what can the folks on the call do?
Realize that you are probably fine. I'll say that. I'll say that you are probably fine. If you are somebody who decided to read, if your reaction to the George Floyd, if you actually were able to stomach watching the horrendous video of that man losing his life, and you were, if you went to the BLM protests, if you went to the Women's March, you need to like take a breather,
Mm.
because it's not you.
Mm.
It's not you being like, if you increase your level of activity 10%, that's not really that important.
Mm.
I'd say there's diminishing returns to that. What
Mm.
you need to do is you need to reach out to people who are disconnected,
Mm.
and you need to say, hey, like I've said this to people, you're disgusted by local politics. You are a socially conservative person who is deeply involved in welfare. Like, like there are deeply religious people who are like, I care about these very social issues. I'm not comfortable voting for Democrats, but I care about poverty. Like they volunteer at homeless shelters and stuff. There's
Mm.
a lot of those people who exist, and a lot of them are disconnected
Mm.
disconnected from politics because it is toxic.
Mm.
And it is. What you need to do is reach out to those people and say, I don't care if you vote for president, be involved
Right.
locally.
Right.
Be involved locally. I don't care if you are this way or that way. We need to be building our networks outward, instead of fighting over who are the people who voted for president the last
Mm.
20 years. Like
Mm.
that's how politics has normally worked. We need to kind of just have a more interconnected society, reaching out to people who are not interested. It's just like, oh, I watch the news. Trump is funny. Trump is an idiot. Whatever. I don't care about that. I care about, did you know that like this is how city council works? If I explain to people who were big Bernie supporters, Warren supporters, rhinos who I know, they were all talking about these different kind of like big issues. And with the quarantine, I think people are focusing a lot more locally, because you can see the impact of policy a lot more on the local level. The DC you see on the news. People were kind of astounded at how the county, and 5 people control the county of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Like the LA County is bigger than Rhode Island.
Hmm.
And like these are things that people need to be focusing on.
Hmm.
And my appeal to people is you don't need to read another book on how awful, like the treatment of every group on the planet has. Like there's another book you can read, and you should, but it's going to be more impactful if you get the person who's kind of iffy about politics to vote locally, or attend some city council meetings, become get involved in anything local. Do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. So that, I agree with you. That's all the time we have. And also, someone reached out to me about being a Democrat delegate, and there's these little roles. You don't have to run for mayor, but there are these roles where you can change things in your local community. I think that's so important to hear, where people are at home and they're just watching Fox or MSNBC or CNN, and they're just schwitzing it, and that's not necessarily healthy. And I like what you said about the wokish folks increasing their capacity by another 10% is not necessarily going to lead to the things that we want to see. It's probably going to lead to society, to burnout from these folks. So I think that's really insightful. How can folks find you? Where should they, if they want to reach you?
If you are interested, send an email to Zach Ritter and he will forward it to me.
Amen.
I respond best over email. RWD Dolan at ucla.edu. Shoot me an email.
R.W. Dolan, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Look, man, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for educating me as always. I love you, man. This is a lot of fun. You really spiced up my Sunday and my week. And these conversations give me life, and I hope it gives our listeners life as well. Everyone out there, thank you for tuning in. Thank you, CWI. Thank you, Joe Brooks. Stay happy, stay curious, and stay safe out there. And thank you again, Mr. Dolan. Appreciate you.